Okay, if you're like me and you watch a lot of booktube, you would have heard the name Haruki Murakami by now. He is one of the most talked about authors on this platform, and for very good reason, I might say. His books tend to be in the magical realism genre and depict the most interesting, strange, and just sometimes just plain weird stories, but they're so capturing and so amazing to read that I can't put them down. There are countless videos on here on where to start with Murakami, what's his best book, talking about him as an author. So I'm probably one of like 100, probably thousands of people who have spoken about Murakami at this point. But I don't care because I still want to talk about him. My initial thoughts on him before reading his books were very mixed, considering I was mainly basing it off of the videos I had seen and the opinions I've heard about him before. I hadn't read any of his books prior to last year when I first read Norwegian Wood on a whim. I never expected his books to be so appealing to me. Even after reading them, I do have a lot of problems with his books. I think any woman does. I still actively search for more Murakami books to read and keep buying more. I've got a small collection so far, which needs to grow. I've only got like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 Murakami books. I could be doing more. My initial thoughts prior to reading him was mainly that he was known for weird sex scenes, which is like a weird thing to hear about an author before going into his work. It was true, they are really weird. It was interesting to go into it hearing a lot of the worst things about the author before hearing the good things. For example, Murakami can't write women. We all know that. He's like a horny man. Like a weirdly horny man. There's way too many things in that book that don't need to be there. And that his stories just become like batshit crazy sometimes. The thing that initially drew me to Murakami was when I found out his books were magical realism. I love magical realism. I have seen like nearly all of the Studio Ghibli films. I love reading books about it. I love seeing short films about it. It's just my favorite genre to look at. And when I found out that Murakami writes that, I was hooked. I was like, I'm buying his books. I'm getting Norwegian Wood. I'm getting Cat from the Shore. I want to see this. And I'm so glad I did. Magical realism is just one of those genres that's just so interesting. It's kind of like absurdism, where it's just a bunch of things just don't make sense. It's all like combining elements of fantasy and real life. And it kind of blurs the line where you can't see what's what. And I live for that. I love it. It's my favorite thing. So it's kind of a no-brainer that I picked up Murakami. I'm glad I did. And I just want to talk about the books I have read so far and what I think of them and what I plan on reading next. The first book I read by him was Norwegian Wood, which is probably the most common introduction. It's kind of what most people say is like the first Murakami book you should read, like the best one to get into him, which I do agree. It is pretty much the best one to get in with. Also, I'm looking at it now and I'm realizing how like water damaged my copy is. It's a bit sad. This book follows the story of our main character, Toru Watanabe, and his story throughout his university life. It's extremely interesting in the way it follows sex, love, relationships, loss, grief, so many topics. And it really just captures the feelings of being a uni student and going through all these tumultuous relationships. One of the things about this book that I really loved when I was reading it was its discussion of death and moving on past death and grief, which is extremely interesting when shown through the perspective of such a young character, considering throughout most of the story, Taru is in his second or first year of university. He's very young and he has lost someone to suicide, a very close friend. I find it so interesting the way that relationships are explored in this book, because you see a character who has lost someone to suicide prior and is now moving on with someone else. And it's just so strange and interesting to see this like dynamic where I don't want to spoil it, but there's just so much crossover between people and relationships and love, and it's really interesting to read. I also just love the exploration of character with his college roommate you see as well. He's a pretty interesting character, and our main guy as well. He's very interesting to read the perspective of. He kind of reminds me of Holden Caulfield as his mindset, but like also not really. He's not as whiny as that man is, but they do kind of have the same outlook on life, which is pretty interesting. Another thing about this book that I really enjoyed when it comes to the topic of life and death is the way that it explores death as a part of life and not the end, which is like one of my favorite ways to explore the theme, because I'm really interested in the way that death correlates with life and how they're intertwined, and I think this book explores it perfectly. This is one of the quotes in the book about death that I found really interesting. I lived through the following spring, at 18, and with that knot of air in my chest, but I struggled all the while against becoming serious. Becoming serious was not the same thing as approaching the truth, I sensed, however vaguely. But death was a fact, a serious fact, no matter how you looked at it. Stuck inside the suffocating contraction, I went on endlessly spinning in circles. Those were strange days, now that I look back at them. In the midst of life, everything revolved around death. He just has a way with words. This man knows how to write. Not women, but he knows how to write prose. Overall, I feel like this was a really good introduction to Murakami and a good first book to start with. Let's move on to the second Murakami book I read. My second book was none other than Kafka on the Shore, which is probably his most popular book, along with Norwegian Wood. For very good reasons, I love this book. In this book, you follow two perspectives. One is Kafka Tamura, who is running away from the curse of his family at the age of 15. The other one is an old man named Nakata who can speak to cats. It's a whack storyline. It's so good. I love it. It's a really interesting storyline, and it's so interesting to see how these two polar opposite characters are in this dual narrative and eventually collide together. It's a bit of a longer one. It stands at 500 pages, but I can guarantee you can read this very quickly because of just how capturing it is and how much you just want to keep going. I loved reading Kafka on the Shore. I remember reading it on the train before uni and like in bed and just not wanting to put it down or being annoyed that I have to go to class now. I can't keep reading on the train. One of the best things about this book is the amount of different stories that I put into one. I mean, as I said, you have two perspectives. You follow this Kafka guy moving on, like going through life without his family, trying to find places to live. It's very interesting. Trying to come to terms with the curse of his family and escape it, pretty much. Another thing about Kafka, the character, is he's like this big reader. You see him in these like libraries reading a lot, which is very interesting how that blends into the novel compared to the other character, Nakata, who can't read. He's an old man. He's unable to do a lot of things. This book just has everything Murakami. It has mysterious like passages that tend to lead to nowhere. Talking cats is another one of his main things. Mysterious women. This is like the most Murakami of Murakami books you'll ever read, and it's a good one, and you should read it. I don't want to give too much away because there is so much that happens in this book, more than you think would happen in a book this thick, but like there is so much going on, and I don't want to spoil it in case any of you guys want to read it, but I will say that there is this one character in it that's Colonel Sanders from KFC, I'm pretty sure, and it made me laugh when I was reading it because I was reading it when I was in KFC eating my lunch, and the KFC I was at had like these like big posters of Colonel Sanders on the wall. It was a really weird coincidence and it was really funny. I still don't get why he's in the book, but yeah, very good. I like to also say, as much as I praise these books, I don't love them. There are some definitely things I dislike about them. Like, there are some really whack and uncomfortable sex scenes, especially in Kafka on the Shore, where I'm like, that should not be in there. I also remember when reading this book, messaging my friend and sending him the wackest things I'd find in the book, and there were so many like interactions between us where I was like, this is a really weird texting that just came up. Why is this here? And he would send me like one back, and I'd be like, I don't understand. Like, it's such a good book, and then there's that. One of the things I'd say about Murakami that stands out most to me is that he will make you feel like you're so engrossed in the world and like you're like really a part of it, and then he'll take you right out through those scenes. It's very annoying. Sometimes I want to throw the book across the room, but then I always come back to it because like it's genuinely a good book still. The next book I read by Murakami was Sputnik's Sweetheart, which is a really short one. It's only about 230 pages, which is like nothing. This is probably my least favorite Murakami book I've read so far. Not because of its length, just because it's all of the things that I dislike about Murakami at the forefront of the story. I feel like he does a really bad job at exploring the female characters in this, considering it's probably the main focus in this one rather than other books. It was still okay, like I didn't hate it. The fact that this is my least favorite Murakami book, but I still gave it a good review, speaks how much I like the author. But I will say it's one of his weaker books. Basically, in this one, our main character goes missing, and we have the love interest that tries to find her, and yet comes across this other woman who the girl has been speaking to. It's kind of confusing. I had a lot of trouble following the plot in this one. I think it's a little bit messy, but I think if I reread this book, I might be able to appreciate it more. I do just think it was a bit hard to follow. I don't have as much to say about this book. I feel like it's one of the least ones I can talk about. But the next one, I actually have quite a bit to say. The next book, and also the most recent book I read by Murakami, is The Winder Bird Chronicle. This follows the story of Toru Akada, whose cat has recently disappeared, and he is searching for his cat to re-find her, and comes across a lot of like wacky people in the middle. You watch him try and find his cat, and then as it progresses, his wife also mysteriously disappears. It's pretty interesting. I love the way that it explores the searching for them. That was really fun. And you also just begin to like explore the environment really well, and you find a lot of like pieces of the city or town that they're in. It is kind of interesting. Like there are a lot of parts of this book where I'm like, this is just cool, I like it, but then I feel like it dragged on just a bit too long. It's nearly 600 pages. Another thing about this book that I found really interesting was this one house that is in the neighborhood that everyone is too scared to buy because there's this legend behind it that everyone who has lived there has like died in that house a miserable death. And I'm pretty sure, I can't remember correctly, I'm pretty sure our main character wants to buy that house, and I just found that so interesting. And like the house was such a captivating part of the novel that I was like, whenever they mentioned it, I was like, I want to hear more about this. Like I'm really liking this house. This one definitely has the best opening. I thoroughly enjoyed the first like 30 pages of this, or I think it's like 50. It's so well written, and it creates such an image off the bat that's just so mysterious and interesting and fun. It makes me want to read the rest of the book. One thing I will say I didn't like about the book is around halfway to like 3/4 through, I was kind of getting a little bit bored. Like it did get a bit repetitive eventually, but I'd still say it's worth reading. Just maybe if I read it a bit faster, I wouldn't have felt the repetitive as much, but because I spread this across like a few weeks, maybe it made it more significant to me. There's also quite a few quotes in this that I really enjoyed. I'll read a couple that I highlighted and I was like, damn, that's some good writing. Would I ever see the rest, or would I grow old and die without ever really knowing her? If that was all that lay in store for me, then what was the point of this married life I was leading? What was the point of my life at all if I was spending it in bed with an unknown companion? It's not a question of better or worse. The point is not to resist the flow. When you go up, you're supposed to go up, and down when you're supposed to go down. When you're supposed to go up, find the highest tower and climb to the top. When you're supposed to go down, find the deepest well and go down to the bottom. When there's no flow, stay still. If you resist the flow, everything dries up. If everything dries up, the world is darkness. I suppose that's one more thing I find about Murakami is he has a lot of like really quotable lines in his books. I think in every single one of his books I've highlighted at least like 5 pages worth of like quotes, which I don't normally do. Normally when I read a book I don't really tend to annotate. I tend to just read and then move on. But there's something about the way he writes that is just like, it just sticks with, like I have to highlight it, I have to remember it. That's all I've read so far from Murakami. I do have 3 more that I haven't read yet. I have After Dark, Dance Dance Dance, and A Hardboard Wonderland. Oh, this is so hard to read. Hold on. Hardboard Wonderland and The End of the World. These are all next on my list. That's all for today. Let me know if there's any Murakami books that you recommend, or what you thought of Murakami if you have read him, or if you're planning on getting into him, what book you want to start with. He's definitely an author worth paying attention to. Even though I do have my gripes of him, I still find value in reading his books. And my gosh, are they just fun to read and interesting. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in my next video.